soon expel its Russian ambassador, saying sanctions are far more meaningful. Heavy rain has left damage on the roads in central Hawke's Bay, with some people isolated and not able to leave home. The district has already had its wettest winter in recent memory, and some coastal areas got nearly 100 millimetres of rain last night. Many roads are closed due to flooding and slips, and the council says the problems are increasing by the hour. Even though the heavy rain warning has been lifted, more rain is expected from tonight and tomorrow. Hundreds of people gathered around New Zealand today to kick off a global climate strike. Simultaneous protests, marches and rallies were held in the main centres to draw attention to climate change and demand action from leaders. Crystal Gibbons reports.
In Wellington, protesters gathered on Parliament's grounds to the tune of rousing chants and speeches calling for action. Many were school students, some with permission to leave school grounds, but all determined to attend the event, vital for their future. In Auckland, protesters marched from Queen Street to Altea Square to the jeers of counter-protesters. Meanwhile, in Christchurch, many older Cantabrians joined in to support their young. Climate action is expected in 7,500 cities across the world today.
Air New Zealand's new flagship non-stop flight from New York to Auckland has had more problems, this time having to divert to Fiji to refuel. NZ1 took off 2 hours late from JFK Airport and hit unusually strong winds. The airline's inaugural flight from New York had to offload 65 passenger bags. A Gloria Vale member says she controls her life in the Christian community, not the leaders. Rachel Steadfast has begun the Gloria Vale leaders' defence in the employment court in Christchurch. Mrs Steadfast, the community's school principal, says she's offended by the plaintiff's claims the leaders controlled every aspect of life.
The leaders wouldn't even have a clue about the details of my life. They don't control when I have a drink or what underwear I wear, whether I choose to have dinner down at the garden or on my veranda or in the lounge room. The leaders don't control when I get pregnant.
All train services in Hutt Valley were briefly suspended this afternoon after a car left the motorway and crossed over the railway lines, hitting the seawall near Ngauronga Gorge around 3:15. One person received minor injuries. And 2 trucks have collided on State Highway 1 in Karapiro, with one rolling. The crash happened before 4 this afternoon, closing the road for a time, but the highway is now back open. It's 5:04. In sport, the Wallabies won't be backing down from the haka before tomorrow night's clash with the All Blacks at Eden Park, with coach Dave Rennie saying they'll use the ritual as a motivator. Australia responded with a boomerang formation ahead of last week's test in Melbourne, which Rennie says upset some of the All Blacks.
Rika Wani had a lot to say to our boys, mouthing off at Falau Whainga around disrespecting the haka, which is a bit odd. When a team does a haka, you respond with a haka. Our response is in the boomerang shape and to move forward, and they're throwing down a challenge, we're accepting it.
A bonus point win would all but secure the Rugby Championship for New Zealand, although all 4 teams still have a chance of winning the title. New Zealand road cycling champion Olivia Ray could be stripped of her national title after being banned from all sport for 2.5 years for doping. The United States Anti-Doping Agency sanctioned the 24-year-old Aucklander for using prohibited substances while riding for a US professional team and erased her results. Cycling New Zealand will investigate races Ray competed in Aotearoa during the past 18 months following the USADA investigation. Drug-Free Sport New Zealand Chief Executive Nick Patterson says this case is an important one.
Substances that she was taking were quite significant. Human growth hormone, clenbuterol, xandrolone, which is an anabolic steroid. These are significant substances with significant effect, and it's dangerous for the health of athletes to be taking these, never mind the sport itself. So these are substances we need to get out of sport.
That's the news.
Tomorrow morning, a journalist who's just won the World Press Freedom Hero Award, but who's under threat and surveillance in his own country, El Salvador. And CNN's Christian Amanpour explains why she refused to cover up for the Iranian president. And do we ever know our own minds? Daniel Pick on the history of brainwashing, mind control. Ko Kim Hilaho, join me tomorrow morning from 8 on RNZ National.
A network funded through New Zealand On Air. We're on radio, rnz.co.nz and on your mobile. Nick Trubridge is here with Checkpoint after the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Saturday. For the northern half of the North Island, from Taranaki and Taupo northwards, also Gisborne, showers becoming widespread and frequent this afternoon, with possible thunderstorms and hail easing to isolated showers tomorrow. Whanganui and Taihape to Kapiti, also Hawke's Bay, scattered showers, possible thunderstorms and hail, turning to rain for a time tomorrow morning and afternoon. Wellington and Wairarapa, rain easing for a time overnight, turning to showers tomorrow evening. Nelson, Marlborough and Canterbury, rain spreading south to reach Christchurch this evening with scattered falls for Nelson, easing to a few showers tomorrow and clearing in Nelson. For Bulla, Westland, Fiordland and Central Otago, mainly fine. For the remainder of Otago and Southland, mainly fine today, but some coastal cloud, becoming cloudy tomorrow with drizzle tomorrow evening. Chatham Islands, cloudy and rain with some heavy falls tomorrow. It's 5:07.
Kia ora, this is Checkpoint. I'm Nick Trubridge. Thousands of men across Russia have been picked up from cities and towns across the country and drafted into the army. Russian President Vladimir Putin wants to bring in another 300,000 civilians into military service.
In this video, verified by the New York Times, men can be seen being loaded into buses. According to the translation, one child can be heard saying, "Goodbye, Daddy." Men are hugged by family members before blowing kisses through the windows of packed coaches. Thousands of men have received draft papers. In some cases, they are school teachers. And according to Russian news media, some school buses are being used to move people to training grounds. There's anger too. Some women are devastated about their loved ones being taken away to fight Putin's war. Others calmly show the draft papers they've been handed, ordering them to verify their military registration documents and join the army.
And of course, this is all going on as world leaders are gathered at the United Nations, where Jacinda Ardern is attending this year's General Assembly. And for the first time since Russia's invasion, key players on either side came face to face around the Security Council table today. Our deputy political editor Craig McCulloch is in New York.
High stakes and high drama at the United Nations, a Security Council showdown as country after country condemned the Kremlin's actions.
Russian diplomats are directly complicit because their lies incite these crimes.
Russia chose to start this war. It must now choose to stop it.
If Russia stops fighting, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends.
Russia's disdain on full display. Its Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov arrived late, gave a 20-minute speech denying war crimes, and then walked out.
He has left the chamber. I'm not surprised. I don't think Mr. Lavrov wants to hear the collective condemnation of this council.
Russia needs to hear that from every corner of the international community.
The escalating conflict has hung heavy over Jacinda Ardern's New York visit, the topic front and centre. She briefly met President Joe Biden at a US reception for leaders yesterday. Russia not on the guest list. This morning she sat down with UN Chief Antonio Guterres, the two discussing how best to ensure Russia feels the weight of the world's opposition to its invasion.
It is illegal. You can use whatever language you want. It is illegal, it is immoral, it is wrong, it needs to end.
Back home, the opposition National Party says the Russian ambassador should be expelled immediately.
Sending him packing, I think, is a minimum position that we should take, given the abhorrence that most New Zealanders would have for the consequences of this dreadful invasion.
For a moment, the Foreign Minister Nanaia Mahuta seemed to be gearing up for the possibility. But not so. The Prime Minister quickly pouring cold water on the idea from New York.
It's actually, of all of the things we could do, that is one of the least meaningful in this situation. In fact, having met just yesterday with the Prime Minister of Ukraine, I really am firming up the view that in their mind the most important thing we could be doing, first and foremost, sanctions, and also supporting them as we have in the ongoing fight within Ukraine.
The war was always going to dominate this week's discourse. Vladimir Putin's actions only amplified that. But in the Pacific, it is another existential threat keeping them up at night. And with that in mind, Ms Ardern today visited a climate change function chaired by Fiji's Frank Bainimarama.
And the entire world needs to hear our message. You cannot tune out or turn away from what we are here to say.
When it comes to the most significant security issue that our region faces, it is by far and away the issue of climate change.
A reminder of the many crises facing the planet and few easy solutions. Tomorrow, Ms Ardern will deliver New Zealand's address to the United Nations, a tiny country, but with a voice like all the rest.
Craig McCulloch there in New York. Meanwhile, in Russia, there is a mass exodus as people try to cross into bordering countries. Here's CNN's Matthew Chance.
Suddenly, an exodus across Russia's borders. Social media now filled with images like these near the country's southern frontiers of vehicles backed up out of sight. Everyone is on the run from Russia, the male voice says. Endless cars, it's mind-boggling, he adds. In the west, towards Finland, border officials also reporting significantly higher traffic. Nearly 5,000 crossing in a single day, and more expected by the weekend, as Russians make for the exits. Across Russia, there's a growing sense of alarm, even anger, at the call-up of reservists to fight in Ukraine. More than 1,300 protesters have already been detained, many of them women, terrified their husbands and sons will be killed. I've got 2 kids of conscription age, says this protester. I brought them up alone, and I don't want to lose them, she cried. And for what, asks her friend. Yeah, just so they can kill the sons of other mothers, she answers. But the mobilization is taking place regardless. Images of reservists like these boarding a military transporter in the Russian Far East show how many are heeding the call to arms. At assembly points, families are saying emotional goodbyes before their men, some apparently in middle age, are bussed away. As what was always cast as a limited special military operation feels more and more like a full-blown war.
Yeah, some pretty shocking pictures there from Matthew Chance in Moscow. It's 14 minutes past 5. Kia mau, tonu mai. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. Right, a quick update now on Air New Zealand's new non-stop flight from New York to Auckland. Now, you'll remember the airline launched this route just this week, and it's the new flagship service, NZ1 from New York to Auckland, is in the air right now, but needs to divert to Fiji to refuel. In a statement, Air New Zealand says there are unusually strong winds in its flight path, so it needs to make a pit stop. There are 210 passengers on board, and they've intentionally left seats unsold to manage the weight on the plane. The statement says the forecast headwinds en route are significantly stronger than usual, stronger than in New Zealand's 12 months of modelling, and other data stretching back much further. Refuelling in Nandi is the standard contingency plan for these circumstances. And on Monday, you might remember the first direct flight from New York got here, but without 65 passenger bags. Air New Zealand said weather conditions meant they couldn't bring all the bags on the flight. Right, meanwhile, voting in local elections is underway, but it's a bit of a slow burn if the early numbers are anything to go by. So far, voting numbers are down on the same time last election. Auckland Electoral Officer Dale Ofsosky says just over 4% of people have voted so far.
So, yes, we are down. What we haven't reflected in those statistics is all those hand-delivered ones that will be arriving this evening from the supermarkets and the libraries and the transport centres.
There is obviously a level of disengagement here, though, right? When you look at, local body elections now compared to, a decade ago, even 5 years ago. What do you suspect is driving this? You've got a bit of experience in this area.
Yes, I mean, the average turnout in 2019 was 42%, which was disappointing then, and it has been dropping. I think the highest we had was about 59% when back in the 80s. So, yes, it has been dropping. I think it's just largely relevance of local government. How does local government affect electors? What is the relevance of it? And therefore, people generally are more disengaged.
So how do you make people care, do you think? I know it's a big, broad question, but what would you do?
What I would like to, we're on a voting system of postal voting. We are not permitted to veer from that, for example, establish or introduce online voting. As an option, we would like to pursue that and see that brought in so that we can re-engage with our younger voters out there, so that, younger people these days, they don't do letters, they don't know what a post box is, all that sort of thing. So if we can have another option that they can be more familiar with, then I think we could re-engage better with them.
National elections, of course, you can vote earlier, but it really does all come down to one particular day, and you only have to turn up to a voting booth to know. It's it's almost a festive atmosphere in many ways, isn't it? And there's a lot of energy there. What do you think of that idea in a local government context?
Good question. The last time a local council undertook a election on the one day, turnout actually plummeted, was 22%, and that was Hutt City back in the 90s. So I'm not quite sure that's the actual solution. Yes, you're right insofar as it's more of a festive activity, but don't forget that central government elections have more relevance to people.
Yeah, you mentioned relevance, and there is an argument there, but local government, it does have a day-to-day effect on people, doesn't it?
It certainly does, because you've got to get your rubbish collected and turn your taps on and all that sort of thing. So it does have a relevance, but I'm not quite sure whether there's a connect there between what council provides and does to what electors think.
So maybe there's a disconnect whereby it's almost not communicated with people well enough, or people can't quite grasp the way local government, the way that council down the road from us in Auckland makes these decisions and the effect it can have.
Yes, that's right. I think another issue could be simply the number of candidates that we have as well. For Auckland Council's mayor, for example, we have 23 vacancies. So that's a lot of people to wade through and read out their profiles before you can actually cast your vote. Not much we can do about that. It's open for everyone. But, that could be a deterrent, for example, when you're looking at voting for mayor, your ward, your local board. We don't have district health boards now, so we don't have that issue to contend with. But there are a large number of candidates that electors have to go through.
Where do you think the responsibility lies, Dale, in terms of trying to lift these numbers? Is it down to the candidates? Is it a council issue?
Councils right across the country have been grappling with this issue and have done for quite some years. Some councils have put a huge amount of effort and resources into try and educate or try and lift the awareness, I think, of the local elections. And at the end of the day, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And we can provide all sorts of education and things like that. But it's a real hard one. And I don't think there's a silver bullet.
It's 5:20, you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Keen to hear your feedback on that one. Have you voted? Are you going to vote? Or do you just not care? And while we are on the Air New Zealand topic, are you planning a trip from New York to Auckland? Will you bother, given you might have to stop over in Fiji if the same thing happens to you? You can text us on 2101 or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Kia ora e te iwi, homai o whakaro, and if you don't want to text or email, you can Facebook us, Checkpoint. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. Here's Karen with the headlines.
Thanks, Nick. The Prime Minister has changed her speech to the United Nations General Assembly in light of Russia's fresh threats of nuclear war. Jacinda Ardern is due to address the Assembly early tomorrow morning and says her speech will emphasise the duty of care held by leaders to keep all people safe. 4 Russian-occupied Ukrainian provinces have begun referendums on whether to join the Russian Federation. The referendums have been condemned as a sham by Kiev and Western countries. Thousands of men across Russia have been drafted into the army, and there is a mass exodus as people try to cross from Russia into bordering countries. A Gloria Vale member has told the Employment Court she chooses to submit herself to her husband. Rachel Steadfast, the Christian Communities school principal, says she gives her husband authority over her, in the same way he gives Christ the authority over him. In New Zealand's new flagship non-stop flight from New York to Auckland has had more problems, this time having to divert to Fiji to refuel. NZ1 took off 2 hours late from JFK Airport and hit unusually strong winds. Heavy rain has damaged the roads in central Hawke's Bay, with some people isolated and not able to leave home. And a reward of up to $20,000 is being offered for information about the disappearance of a Christchurch man almost 7 years ago. Richard Hinckley was last seen at his home in the suburb of Edgware on Christmas Day 2015. On the traffic front on Auckland's motorways, a breakdown has been blocking the left southbound lane on State Highway 1 after the Papakura off-ramp. Still blocked at last reports, with tow trucks struggling to get through heavy traffic. Drivers heading south should expect delays of up to 30 minutes. In Wellington, an earlier crash on the motorway on State Highway 1, blocking the left northbound lane at the State Highway 2 interchange, has now been cleared with all lanes open. And in Waikato, there are delays on both directions on State Highway 1 between Cambridge and Karapiro after a truck crash near Karapiro about an hour ago. We'll have more news headlines and any traffic updates for you around 5:40.
Thanks, Karen. A top New Zealand cyclist is today facing a lengthy ban, or the reality of lengthy time out of competition, after copping a hefty ban for doping. Current national road race champion Olivia Ray has been suspended for 2.5 years by the United States Anti-Doping Agency, and it could have been worse had she not owned up to using the banned substances. Well, here with me for more on this is our sports reporter Clay Wilson. There's a bit of detail here, so fill us in on what's happened.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, national road race champion, she won that title in February this year, but then in March she was provisionally suspended by USADA. A few months on now, she's been handed this 2.5 year ban. Now, at the time that she committed these offences, she was living and competing in the US. USADA got some information from a whistleblower, we don't know who that is, about what she was doing, what was going on. They followed that up, they found some evidence, and then they confronted her with that evidence. And she has apparently, according to USADA, fully cooperated with them. She's admitted using 3 different banned substances. She says they were provided to her by her then partner, a guy who was also an amateur cyclist by the name of Jackson Nash. So Olivia Ray hasn't denied this here, but she did speak to the Herald in July, and she said that she didn't take these substances to win races. She was in a relationship that was abusive, she said, and she was doing it as a way of winning approval from her partner. In terms of the ban, she was actually facing 4 years. You mentioned there it could have been worse, but because she admitted these offences, she got a year off that, and then another 6 months for providing evidence on Jackson Nash, who himself has been handed a lifetime ban from cycling. So a fair bit going on here in terms of her results. Her results in the US have been wiped, and she's going to have to give some prize money back as well from races that she did well in. Here in New Zealand, with a national title specifically, hasn't officially been wiped yet, but Cycling New Zealand have come out and said they are investigating that in the races that she took part in here in New Zealand. They say they fully support USADA, but they don't have access to the details of that USADA investigation, so therefore they're going to conduct their own investigation, going all the way back to May last year, which is when these races are said to be covering.
And it's pretty unusual, isn't it, given she is, well, you don't often see New Zealand cyclists in the headlines for doping, do you, A? But secondly, certainly not current current New Zealand champions.
No, I think that's the big story here, right, is that she's the current New Zealand champion. Road race titles are very prestigious in New Zealand here, so to have someone of that stature who's so recently won it just six or 8 months ago, to be caught up in a situation like this, not a great look, no.
The All Whites are back in the country, probably not with their tails too far between their legs, because they did all right in Brisbane last night against the Socceroos.
Yeah, 1-0 loss, but I thought watching the game, for large parts, they were arguably the better team against the Socceroos. There's a vast gap in the world rankings, and of course the Socceroos are going to the World Cup, the All Whites aren't, but they competed very well, and a lot of the younger players I thought standing out for the All Whites, which does bode well for the future, and they do have a chance to get one back. Of course, that game here in Auckland on Sunday, which will be the first home game for the All Whites for 5 years, would you believe it? And also a farewell game for Winston Reid. I might have touched on this last week, but his last game for the All Whites. So I think around 25,000, perhaps more now, tickets sold for that game, and All Whites fans pretty keen to get back and see the team.
And it's, as you mentioned, one part of the triple header, isn't it? All Blacks, Black Ferns tomorrow, and then All Whites on Sunday. Just on the All Blacks, though, we discussed Samisoni Taukei'aho at length last night, as well as Will Jordan. But RTS, Roger Tuivasa-Sheck, there's been a bit of discussion around him as well, because he's been included in these squads this year, but he hasn't exactly played a whole lot, and he's maybe not going to tomorrow. He's on the bench.
On the bench. We discussed this yesterday about second five, right, that they'd had an opening here, and they'd opted to bring Geordie Barrett in and not play Roger Tuivasa-Sheck. And like you say, he was named in the first squad of the year and has been in the team. He has gone out to play a bit for Auckland, but he has technically been in the team. You think maybe this is the good opportunity to bring him in and give him a shot. And some people saying, well, if you're not going to play him now, when are you going to play him? Is he going to be up to it? Maybe does he think about going back to league? This kind of thing. But I guess you have to remember the Rugby Championship is still on the line here. Perhaps they're playing it safe a little bit in that way. And talking to his teammates this week, the question came up about him, and they seem to be pretty positive. They insist he's not getting too frustrated or kicking stones about not making it. And I get the sense with a player like Roger Tuivasa-Sheck, he's chasing a dream here. He's left rugby league and all the riches that came with that to chase this dream, and a World Cup just around the corner. I don't think he's going to give up on that just yet, but is an interesting talking point for sure.
He's always seemed like a pretty cool head, isn't he, who can sort of handle these sorts of things.
Yes,
Thanks, Clay. Much appreciated. Clay Wilson there, our sports reporter. And while we are on that triple header, the Black Ferns, the All Blacks and the All Whites, of course, it's all taking place at Eden Park, and so fittingly joining us is Nick Sauntner, who is the CEO of Eden Park. Kia ora, Nick.
Kia ora, and thanks for your time.
Hey, look, let's start with the triple header itself. How are the groundskeepers going? Are they round the clock? Have they clocked off for a beer yet? How's prep going?
Well, the team is still in the office, and the turf team are out on the field currently after 4 captains' runs. It's another historic weekend for the park, and we're just excited to be delivering more memorable moments and attracting global audiences back to the Garden of Eden.
And, of course, 3 games, right? So you've got a switch from, rugby, and rugby's easier, but then a quick switch to football for Sunday. Talk to us about logistics, a big job for your guys and girls.
It is, and I think probably the best way to describe it, we've got over 2,000 staff in catering working across Saturday and Sunday. A number of those staff are actually volunteers that we've been able to secure through church groups and also rugby clubs. So it's a massive effort by the team. We've got a lean team of 41 in terms of our full-time resources, but then also over 3,000 casual staff will be deployed over the weekend.
I think last time we spoke, Nick, we were, if not in the middle of the pandemic, coming out of one, we're still in it, but, in terms of lockdowns and things, you were talking about things like how do you get people in who are vaccinated, are there passes, how are our games going to go? Fast forward, this must feel pretty good for you.
Well, as you can imagine, the team are just delighted to actually be able to deliver for the city, but also the country. We're back together. The sports-loving public have paid for the privilege to attend these 3 matches in our workplace. And we've got a game plan that talks about values and behaviours. We want everyone to arrive early to embrace the stadium again after 2 years of disruption.
Now, Nick, of course, You're an AFL guy, and there's another relatively large game happening over the weekend across the ditch. I don't want to take the attention off Eden Park, but sell us yours over maybe switching into the MCG.
Well, I must admit that we will have some TVs at Eden Park with the AFL going. There'll be 100,000 fans at the G, a massive contest against Geelong and the Sydney Swans. The Swans winning by a point last week against Collingwood to get into the final. And, one day in September in Melbourne is one of those events that everyone wants to attend, and everyone attending will always remember.
So a few TVs at the park with that on, but all the action's on the field, eh?
That's right. And we can't influence the result on the field, but I can say that when teams come to Eden Park, they play the All Blacks or the Black Ferns, but they also play the Fortress. And I'm hopeful that that winning record, almost 90%, will continue, and that fortress that is Eden Park is something that we're all very proud of.
Ticket sales, Nick, bring us up to date for the weekend.
Yeah, so Saturday is a sellout, and then on Sunday we've got now over 30,000 tickets in market. It's looking like it's going to be a beautiful Sunday afternoon. It's the first time in history that the All Whites have played at Eden Park, our national stadium, and obviously Winston Reid's farewell game. So we want people to buy in advance. We want them to come from gate opening, get in, get some food, get some beverages into them, enjoy the experience after 2 years of disruption, but then also post-event businesses in Kingsland and Dominion Road. It's been a challenging period for the hospitality sector, so we want people to support the economic benefit of these events. That you'll see over 10 million of economic benefit for Auckland this weekend.
All Blacks Australia, who's taking it, Nick?
The Fortress will continue, the All Blacks will win.
As for the women's game?
Definitely the Black Ferns, and then just encourage people, the 8th of October, triple header. We want a world record, and buy your tickets for seeing that Rugby World Cup.
And finally, the football on Sunday.
I'm tipping a bit of a surprise. The All Whites, Winston Reid to score the winning goal.
Wow, talk, Nick, and this is all from an Aussie, people, remember, so, maybe we're on to something.
That's exactly right.
Thanks, Nick. Nick Swartner there, who is, of course, the Chief Executive at Eden Park. Always a great sport. Right, it is 5:33. Kia mau tonu mai. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. Nona Peltier is here with our business news. Tourism Holdings. Tell us what's happening with them.
Well, they've jumped another hurdle on their way to doing a merger with Apollo, which is a company in Australia that does very similar kind of business, camper vans and so on. The Commerce Commission has given them the green light. It's depending on Apollo selling up some of their assets to a company called Juicy, which is sort of the same business, camper vans and hotels, etc. But that's still not a done deal. We'll have to see how that shakes down, because we still have the Australian regulator to approve the deal, and some shareholder and other regulations you have to pass.
Difficulties changing, or cancelling rather, recurring debit and credit card spends, I suppose. What are we talking about here, and what can you do about it?
Well, let's say you buy something online, say a service like a subscribing streaming service or something like that, and then you decide to cancel. Well, you have to get it in writing from the merchant. You can't just go to your bank and say, oh, this company is charging me, I canceled it. And the bank says, well, sorry, we can't help you with that. Banks can only cancel direct debits. They cannot cancel credit card payments. So if you have a recurring payment through a credit card, a debit card, you need to cancel that with the merchant. The merchant is in charge of that particular transaction. However, if you get it in writing, if you say, I've canceled this service, I no longer want it, and you were within your rights to do so, then, and only then, can the credit card companies help you by reversing those charges. They still can't cancel them, though, because merchants have the right to continue to demand payment, even if you close that account, even if you cancel the credit card. They can still come after you for that money. So make sure you understand your terms when you sign up for these types of things. These free deals may not be free at all.
Thanks for the tips. It's an educational program, isn't it?
Well, it is really in some ways.
Markets, please.
Markets. Well, we closed down nearly 0.75% today. That was an 84-point drop to 11,435. Not surprising. We've been beaten up by higher interest rates with the U.S. Federal Reserve, and not just them, other banks around the world. And the dollar is trading at 58.3 US cents, 88.1 Australian, 51.9 pence.
Thanks, Nona. Have a great long weekend. We will see you again on, I was about to say Monday, Tuesday. All right, thousands of students have rallied on streets around the country calling for more action on climate change. Simultaneous protests, marches and rallies were held in the main centres to draw attention to the climate and demand action from leaders. Our reporter Crystal Gibbons and cameraman Sam Rulstone have the story.
People! Power! People! In Wellington, protesters gathered on Parliament's grounds with rousing chants and speeches calling for action. School Strike for Climate Wellington says it has 6 key demands. Spokesperson Sarah Lewis says they include making agriculture practices in New Zealand more sustainable.
But part of that is creating a just transition for farmers who are in those unsustainable practices and other industries, to provide them with training and courses and other career opportunities in more sustainable fields.
Fellow spokesperson Frankie Huffnance says they've also got demands around free public transport.
And along with that, so we've got improved cycleways and walkways, making sure that all those areas of our cities are accessible for everyone.
Among those striking today was school student Imogen.
We're the future. We need a planet to live on, and at the moment, what the government's doing, it's not enough. We need to make changes.
Also there was 7-year-old Amada, whose family came up from Nelson for the event in the capital.
We want to save the environment so we don't run out into extinction.
Green MPs also joined in on the action. Green co-leader and Climate Minister James Shaw says the consequence of climate change has been obvious this year.
If you talk to the people of Westport and Bulla who are sandbagging their houses for the 4th time, if you're from Nelson and you went through those horrendous floods recently, if you're in Tairāwhiti and the storms and the floods up there, the droughts in Northland, in the middle of autumn, the Waituna wetlands in Southland, the soggiest place in winter in the country, catching fire because it was so dry.
It was a sentiment that was echoed by protesters in Auckland.
I'm down here today because the time is up, and I'm speaking on behalf of a planet that is crying for help.
Hundreds marched along Queen Street together in Altea Square. Organiser Sophie Todd says as part of the global strike, they were striking for climate reparations and climate justice.
Which means supporting people that are already being impacted by climate change rather than bribing rich people to buy electric vehicles.
In the Christchurch, about 400 people gathered for the protest in Cathedral Square. There were many grey heads among the crowd as older Cantabrians joined in to support the rangatahi. Canterbury University student Carter Andrews says he's disappointed by the lack of action by the Christchurch City Council.
The idea here is to definitely focus on the candidates and sort of show the candidates that the youth are here and that we care and that this is something that we're really worried about, and that if elected to council we need them to be doing something about this. This is something that they should be taking seriously, and that's what we're here to try and get through today.
15-year-old Oscar Compton Moen says young people care about the climate because it's their future at stake.
I think young people feel really ignored. I think for so long we've sort of just been, we haven't really been heard, listened to, and I think that's really harmful. I think we represent a large part of the population and we represent the future, and I think it's important that the council really listens to us.
Climate action is expected to take part in 7,500 cities around the globe across the course of the day.
And we'll put Sam and Crystal's video up on our website if you want to have a look at it. Right, a little bit of your feedback now. Let's start with Air New Zealand. Mike says, no problem stopping over in Fiji, but I would like my bags to arrive with me in Auckland. Yeah, that is, I mean, a stopover in Fiji could be worse places to stop over, but you kind of want your bags, don't you? Voting in local body elections, of course, that is, well, in Auckland at least, well down on this time last year. Lindsay in Whakatane is, well, doing her due diligence, which is good. I will be voting in local elections. My papers arrived only on Wednesday. I have over 2 weeks yet to vote, but I will not vote before attending a candidates meeting. Yeah, good advice, actually. And this one, here's an idea which I think I can probably get behind. I'm sure everyone else can as well. If they gave a 10% rate discount to those households who vote, this would increase numbers. Do you reckon? Yeah, quite possibly, definitely. Right, it is 20 minutes to 6. Your checkpoint. Kia ora e te iwi, homai o whakaaro. Don't forget you can text us on all of our stories tonight on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, Facebook us Checkpoint, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Here's Karen with the headlines.
A Gloria Vale member says the Christian community cannot afford to pay everyone for their work. Rachel Steadfast told the Employment Court in Christchurch that everyone who is able to is expected to serve the community. Thousands of students have gathered on streets around the country calling for more action on climate change. Protest marches and rallies were held in the main centres to demand action from leaders. Air New Zealand's new flagship non-stop flight from New York to Auckland has had more problems, this time having to divert to Fiji to refuel. NZ1 took off 2 hours late from JFK Airport and hit unusually strong winds. The Prime Minister has changed her speech to the United Nations General Assembly in light of Russia's fresh threats of nuclear war. Jacinda Ardern is due to address the Assembly early tomorrow morning and says her speech will emphasise the duty of care held by leaders to keep all people safe. 4 Russian-occupied Ukrainian provinces have begun referendums on whether to join the Russian Federation. Thousands of men across Russia have been drafted into the army, and there's a mass exodus as people try to cross from Russia into bordering countries. And a man who was found to be insane when he stabbed to death a couple in their Auckland home last year can now be identified as their son. The Court of Appeal has dismissed Sheil Bangera's bid to keep his name permanently suppressed. In traffic news on Auckland's motorways, a breakdown is blocking the right southbound lane on State Highway 1 after the East Tamaki Road off-ramp. Merge left with care and expect delays. Another breakdown has been blocking the left southbound lane on State Highway 1 after the Papakura off-ramp. And in Waikato there are delays in both directions on State Highway 1 between Cambridge and Karapiro after a truck crash near Karapiro Road earlier this afternoon. It's 17 to 6.
Thanks, Karen. The Gloria Vale School principal says the Christian community and their way of life are being attacked by those who have chosen to leave. Gloria Vale's leaders began their defence today in the Employment Court in Christchurch, where 6 former members are seeking the ruling they were employees and not volunteers while in the community. Neva Chittick was in court.
People who have left think that they can speak for us. I believe that those still living at Gloria Vale should be allowed to speak for themselves and be heard.
That's Rachel Steadfast, the principal of Gloria Vale Christian School. She strongly rejects former members' claims Gloria Vale leaders control every aspect of their lives.
The leaders wouldn't even have a clue about the details of my life. They don't control when I have a drink or what underwear I wear, whether I choose to have dinner down at the garden or on my veranda, or in the lounge room. The leaders don't control when I get pregnant.
Mrs Steadfast says she was also able to choose her husband and to be a teacher in the community. She has worked in the community's early childhood centre and school for 20 years. She says it has given her a range of contacts outside Gloria Vale, and she frequently travels for work. Rachel Steadfast says she has drawn parallels between the community and marae visits.
The way the tangata whenua worked together and shared what they had and what work there was to do. On a marae, the people do not pay each other for communal work. They consider it part of their contribution to the survival and existence of their people and culture.
She says she doesn't teach for money, instead donating her government salary to Gloria Vale so the whole community can benefit. Mrs Steadfast says she also chooses to submit to her husband.
As a woman, I give my husband that authority over me, and I give my trust and put my trust in him, the same way he gives Christ the authority over him.
Mrs Steadfast is a mother to 9 children, one of which she breastfed while giving evidence in court.
The ability and power to give life to another is something I wouldn't trade for anything the world could offer. I have never had any of my children for the sake of the shepherds. This is my personal choice.
However, when questioned by the plaintiff's lawyer, she did admit a government benefit was received by every child who was enrolled in Gloria Vale's early childhood centres. Rachel Steadfast became upset speaking about her relationship with the former Gloria Vale woman who have brought the case.
I grew up with the plaintiffs. I loved them and shared many happy memories with them. I worked with them and lived in the same household with them. Some are my relations.
The defence will continue their case next week.
Sex workers say they have been exploited by strip clubs due to a grey area around their employment rights. Clubs are taking $1,000 bonds and fining dancers up to $200 for taking sick leave or turning up late. Engaged by strip clubs as contractors rather than employees, the performers say they are missing out on the protection of the law. But are they? Our reporter Haisa Almeida reports.
Vixen Temple has been in the sex industry for 4 years. The 26-year-old says most strip clubs she has worked at take advantage of performers.
The contracts are so dodgy and so illegal, but you're not allowed to work until you sign them, and you're often rushed into signing them so that, you just want to make money.
She says she was asked for an $1,100 bond to start work at the Auckland strip club Showgirls back in 2019. In her contract, cited by RNZ, the so-called administration retainer was justified by the club because Miss Temple was using the club's facilities as a contractor and could be paid up front or taken out of the performer's wages. The agreement also states the club could increase the bond up to another $1,000 in case of high turnover, public holidays, and for national or sports events. Vixen Temple says the exploitation of dancers comes with a stigma around the industry.
You don't hear that happening to any other independent contractor, but because these managers know, again, that the general public doesn't care about the sex workers' safety, they know that we have no one to turn to.
Miss Temple, who worked as Showgirls for 2 years, says she was paid daily in cash, which came from tips and private dances. The $1,100 bond was taken incrementally from her wages, but it was not the only fee taken. After a post-traumatic stress incident, Miss Temple says she called in sick to work, which she is legally entitled to do. But the club thought differently.
They emailed me later in the week saying they were going to fine me $200 or $250 because I didn't show up to my shift. But I gave a doctor's note. I gave you an hour's notice. I'm sorry, I couldn't give you any more. I just did all I could do, but they fined me still.
She says working to lose money was not in her plans.
That was getting really frustrating for me because I had entered this industry to have that freedom to not work when I needed to. I was now losing money. Every time I wouldn't work, I would get fined.
23-year-old Indy has been a stripper in Auckland for 3 years. She says fines are commonplace in many strip clubs.
Definitely girls can get fined a lot if they're late. I've been fined for being late too, or try and leave halfway through a shift.
But she says the fines depended on the mood of the managers.
I've been sick before and just texted in and it was fine. They suddenly decided that I would get fined if I didn't have a medical certificate, out of the blue. There's no clear rules, it's so hard.
Employment law advocate Danny Gelb says because most clubs take performers as independent contractors instead of employees, the contract rules are blurred.
If they're engaged as employees and you try to fine them, then the Employment Relations Authority would come down on the employer like a ton of bricks. So that's probably why they have been engaged as contractors, so they don't have the protections of the Employment Relations Act to get in the way of their business.
Being a contractor not only allowed Vixen to be fined, but also not to be eligible for assistance after a work incident left her with a permanent scar on her face.
They had me strapped to a bondage wheel where they had it poorly assembled and it broke, and I smashed my face. I now have a permanent scar in my lips. I had to take time off work, and they paid for my glasses to be replaced. That was their hush money of please don't tell anyone what happened.
The Aotearoa New Zealand Prostitutes Collective is a not-for-profit organisation that provides information and support for sex workers. Its founder, former sex worker Dame Catherine Healy, says clubs treat dancers as contractors so they can financially control them without having to deal with legislation.
I think the clubs feel they can get away with it, and there's this kind of idea that sex workers or dancers need controlling and firm hand is a good hand. There's all that kind of patronising approach.
But for Vixen, the passion for the stage performing is what moves her to keep fighting for better conditions in the sex industry.
It's a simple solution here. Stop letting the managers exploit us. It's annoying for us, and it makes it really difficult for us to want to show up to work and to perform. It's just ridiculous. And we as the workers, when we talk about this to the general public, we get silenced because it's oh no, we need to shut down the sex work industry entirely. But it doesn't have to be that way.
Showgirls has not responded to multiple requests for an interview or comment.
It's 9 minutes to 6. Kia mau tonu mai. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National Right. An update now on Air New Zealand's non-stop flight from New York to Auckland. NZ1 is facing, as we reported earlier, unusually strong winds on its flight path to Auckland and is now diverting to Fiji to refuel. In the last few minutes, the airline has confirmed to Checkpoint it is flying a replacement crew to Nandi to bring passengers from New York home. That crew is currently en route. A source has told Checkpoint this is because the new flight time would go beyond the working hours agreed to with the cruise union. The flagship route has had a difficult launch. On Monday, the first flight from New York got here, but minus the bags of 65 customers. Air New Zealand said weather conditions meant they couldn't bring all the bags on the flight. We will keep you updated on that. Right, the polls in local body elections close in just over a fortnight, with many candidates focused on opposition to the Three Waters reforms. But the government shows little sign of slowing its ambitious plan, and incoming councillors and mayors, well, they'll have little ability to stop it. Here's our political reporter, Russell Palmer.
It's full steam ahead for Three Waters, with legislation on track to be in place by the end of the year. A recent survey of all 291 mayoral candidates showed over 3/4 oppose the plan to centralise council water services into 4 big standalone entities. Porirua Mayor Anita Baker wants a stronger local voice, but is otherwise largely supportive. She's had first-hand experience of single-issue candidates, including on the campaign trail.
And absolutely, I do worry about those sort of things. But actually, I know that the status quo can't stay as it is and that we can't afford not to do it.
Most councils agree some kind of reform is needed and back greater Māori involvement. But they don't believe the government's model as proposed is the right way to go. Outgoing Auckland Mayor Phil Goff fears a lost opportunity for change if agreement can't be reached, but believes what's on the table diminishes accountability and responsiveness. But he says opponents need to do what Auckland has done and come up with solutions.
They really need to say what their clear alternative is, because the status quo won't serve anybody's purposes.
The opposition group Communities for Local Democracy has proposed alternative models, rejected by the government as unworkable. Timaru was one of the first to sign up and also took the government to court over asset ownership rights. Mayor Nigel Bowen says his personal stance is the same, but candidates need more than one focus.
When you're going into these positions, you've got to think, wider than one issue.
This is a significant issue confronting politicians at both local and central level. Labour's deeply committed to pushing ahead. Just as adamant, a National Act pledging to repeal Three Waters before it takes full effect in 2024. Mr Bowen wants more political consensus ahead of next year's election.
You've got to remember this reform isn't a done deal. It's at best 50-50. You've got one side of the House wanting to push it through and then the other side of the House saying they're going to repeal it. So it would be great if we could actually get some bipartisan support for big reforms.
In the end, the government of the day will make the final call. Selwyn's Mayor Sam Broughton says they've already invested in water systems and don't want residents paying again to bring nearby districts up to standard. But he also warns candidates need to know where their influence ends.
If you want to change government direction, then stand for government, get involved in national politics. If you want to deliver locally for the community within the rules of our nation, then stand for local council and get involved in delivering for community today.
Associate Local Government Minister Kieran McAnulty has visited more than 40 councils since taking up the role in June, but refused to talk to RNZ about that until his tour's complete.
And there'll be more on that story on Focus on Politics after Checkpoint this evening. Glow-in-the-dark roads are being test run in eastern Victoria in the hope they'll improve road safety. The illuminated line markings mean you can clearly see the road ahead while you're driving at night. That's handy. A Bedsdale-based company, Tarmac Line Marking, has installed the glow-in-the-dark markings on 700 metres of road as a trial. The company's operations manager, John Emanuele, explains how it works.
It's a plastic material, goes down at about 190 degrees onto the road. We do it in two layers. The layer is a base coat. The top layer is a clear coat with the photoluminescence. So your base coat works pretty much as a battery. During the day, it charges up. At night time, it then starts doing its job, giving that nice green glow.
And you are on the installation side of things, right? So where are you rolling this out and why?
Yeah, look, we were lucky enough to be picked by our partners of Victoria, Vic Roads here in Victoria, to be one of the first ones to trial the product. So we've got the setup to do it's about $700,000 worth of equipment, which we do a lot of line marking with anyway. We got to test that on a place called Meetung in East Gippsland, actually, very close to home. So we went out and we've done about 700 metres to a kilometre of centre and edge lines in a fairly dark sort of area with a couple of little windy bends in it. It's a great product.
And for people who aren't watching, this stuff it really is glow in the dark, right? It is about as fluorescent as you could hope for. So I guess what is the hope when it comes to improvements in road safety?
Yeah, certainly in those black spot areas, really, really tight turns where your headlights are facing in a forward direction, but you might have a left-hand or right-hand turn coming up that's really, really sharp. You will literally see those lines to the right or to the left here heading around that corner. So as you're leading up, looking forward, you'll already have that bit more timing to pick up on that corner. Be fantastic for that installation around alpine areas, hilly and windy country, but really good for dark push bike zones, pedestrian zones, whether it be boat ramps, playgrounds. It's really got a lot of applications that this could be used for.
And you were saying what? So basically it charges up during the day. By the time nightfall comes around, it's really beaming, basically.
That's right, yeah. So look, obviously a cloudy day, it's going to be less of illumination, but I've been out to our site on rainy days, dark days, and been back out that night, and it still stands out. But certainly, your summer months, less cloud around it. It is bright. You put a piece of it metre long in a dark room, and it lights the room up. It's phenomenal how it works.
So, say you're driving one of these roads not only at night, but when it's bucketing down with rain, that's still fairly visible because, of course, dark roads in New Zealand, for example, they're terrible to see when it's dark, but when it's raining, it's even worse. It's almost washed out.
Yeah, that's right. Look, in the rain, it still has that glow effect. Really, really well, I say. While your lights are particularly on that line, you don't see you're seeing the greenish sort of looking line, but it's more the area where you're going that you can't see at that point that just stands out. And whether it be rain, anything like that, it still penetrates. You can see it. Really stands out well.
How receptive have the local authorities been, John?
Yeah, look, there's been a lot of talk, local or national, even overseas now. So it's been unbelievable. There's a lot of people locally heading out the road to have a look. But to really get the effect, you need to pull up off the side of the road, turn your lights off, and have a look at the product. It's caused a lot of traffic out that road, I think, with spectators.
RNZ News at 6 o'clock. Good afternoon, I'm Karen McCarthy. 4 Russian-occupied Ukrainian provinces have begun referendums on whether to join the Russian Federation. Officials say they have opened polling stations, but there won't be queuing allowed because of security concerns. Hugo Bachega of the BBC reports from Kiev.
Ukraine says the vote, which is backed by President Putin, has no legal force. Officials here see it as Russia's reaction to defeats on the battlefield as Ukraine fights to reclaim territory. The so-called referendums will be held in occupied areas of Luhansk and Donetsk in the east and Zaporizhia and Kherson in the south. They're expected to run until Tuesday.
It's expected the results will be used by Moscow as a pretext for escalating the war. Air New Zealand is blaming unusually strong winds for its flagship non-stop flight from New York to Auckland, having to make a refuelling stop in Fiji. NZ1 took off 2 hours late from JFK Airport in New York. The airline says the plane will make a short stop in Nandi to refuel. It says all 210 customers were told of the delay before departure, and they have intentionally left seats unsold to manage wait. The airline's inaugural flight from New York landed in Auckland on Monday morning without 65 passenger bags, so it could meet load limits. Air New Zealand said weather conditions meant they couldn't bring all the bags on the flight. A Gloria Vale member has told the Employment Court she chooses to submit herself to her husband. Rachel Steadfast, the Christian Communities School principal, addressed the court in Christchurch today as part of the Gloria Vale defence. Mrs Steadfast says she signed a commitment document to submit herself to the leaders who God placed in the community.
As a woman, I give my husband that authority over me. And I give my trust and put my trust in him, the same way he gives Christ the authority over him.
Rachel Steadfast says there will be men who abuse the submission of their wife, but she says the commitment is a protection for the women. At a school strike for climate in Christchurch, the council was called on to agree to 4 demands, including increasing housing density in the city. About 400 people took part in the school strike for climate march in Christchurch today. The march ended in front of the Christchurch City Council buildings, where one of the organisers, 16-year-old Rowan Matthew, asked the council to support light rail, more cycleways and environmental education, and to allow denser housing. She says the urban sprawl encourages the car culture and does nothing to reduce the high percentage of emissions from transport. Other protests, part of a worldwide weekend of action, were held in Auckland and Wellington and other areas. Sex workers say they have to pay to work as strip clubs all over the country are asking for bonds and imposing fines in the event of lateness or sickness. The founder of the Aotearoa Sex Workers Collective, Dame Catherine Healy, says clubs treat dancers as contractors so they can financially control them without having to deal with regulation. Dame Catherine says the fining system is outdated, unfair and patronising. A lack of interest in the function of councils is being suggested as a reason for low voting numbers so far. Auckland Electoral Officer Dale Ofsosky says just over 4% of people have voted in the local body elections to date. But he says that doesn't include papers that voters have delivered by hand to supermarkets, libraries and transport centres. Mr Ofsosky says the highest turnout for council elections was 59% in the 1980s, but it's been dropping ever since.
I think it's just largely relevance of local government. How does local government affect electors? What is the relevance of it? And therefore people generally are more disengaged.
Dale Ofsosky says online voting could be an option to encourage younger people to vote. State Highway 1 has reopened following a truck crash at Karapiro in Waikato. Police say there is a significant amount of traffic built up in the area and motorists are advised to expect delays. The head of the UN's World Food Programme in Haiti, Jean-Martin Bouer, is criticising recent attacks against two of its warehouses. The raids happened amid violent anti-government protests triggered by the end of fuel subsidies. That's the news.
What was the average age of the people who wanted to make friends? Were they all different ages?
It'd be like a uni go up to maybe mid-30s.
And what about the gender match?
Oh, only female, which was quite nice, to be honest. Nothing skeezy.
There's a new word. Skeezy, did you say?
I think I said skeezy, and I think I made it up. I apologise.
No, I like it.
I said keep the skis at home.
Up to date if you're up late. Lately with Karen Hay every weeknight from 10 on RNZ National.
On air, on rnz.co.nz and on your mobile. Back to Checkpoint with Nick Trubridge after the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Saturday, and it's an updated one. For the northern half of the North Island, from Taranaki and Taupo northwards, also Gisborne, showers, some heavy with thunderstorms and hail possible, becoming isolated and light tomorrow. Whanganui and Taihape to Kapiti, also Hawke's Bay, scattered showers with possible thunderstorms and hail, turning to rain for a time in the morning and tomorrow afternoon. Wellington and Wairarapa, rain easing for a time overnight, turning to showers tomorrow evening. Nelson, Marlborough and Canterbury, rain spreading south to Christchurch tonight, scattered falls for Nelson, easing to a few showers tomorrow and clearing in Nelson. Bulla, Westland, Fiordland and Central Otago, mainly fine. For the remainder of Otago and Southland, mainly fine today, but some coastal cloud. Areas of low cloud or fog from tonight with drizzle tomorrow evening. And the Chatham Islands, cloudy, rain with some heavy falls tomorrow. It's just gone 6:06.
No mai hoki mai. Russians are queuing up at the border to escape military service. Tickets for direct flights between Russia and Serbia, well, they've sold out. And it all comes after President Vladimir Putin called in up to 300,000 reservists to boost forces in Ukraine. More than 1,400 people have been arrested across Russia as they protest against the mobilization order. The BBC's Steve Rosenberg reports.
Called up by the Kremlin, they set off for Ukraine. Russian reservists, now part of Vladimir Putin's war. There were scenes like these across Russia. A sense of shock at the first mobilization here since World War II, and apprehension at what lies ahead. Daddy, cries a child, as another group departs. But there was anger too, outside a recruitment office. The protester says World War II was a real war, but this one, it's just politics. Protesting in Russia can be dangerous. Mikhail Suyetin was detained at an anti-mobilization protest in Moscow. He says that down at the station, police tried to give him call-up papers.
When I refused to take the call-up papers, an official said, "Suit yourself, but you'll be sent to prison for 10 years. She said it was against the law to refuse the draft.
The public's being told the motherland is in danger. The message from the Russian authorities to the Russian people is, we had to call up the reservists. The West is trying to destroy us. NATO is waging a war against us. This is a fight for Russia's future. But some Russians have now concluded that for them, there is no future here. At Russia's border with Georgia, the queue of cars was unusually long, as some Russian men of fighting age tried to leave the country.
I heard some speeches.
Victor has decided to leave Russia because of the call-up. Victor is not his real name. He's asked us to hide his identity.
There is a choice. For example, you go and you kill innocent people, or you go to jail. I decided I don't want to make this choice. I'd better to live my life somehow, I don't know, from abroad.
Up until now, many Russians have tried to block out what's happening in Ukraine and get on with their lives. The call-up of hundreds of thousands of reservists has changed that. Reality is starting to hit home.
And joining us now live from Moscow is our correspondent Stuart Smith. Morning, Stuart, where you are. Look, first of all, we're hearing reports this evening, our time, of the borders between Russia and Georgia and Mongolia effectively collapsing under pressure from overwhelming traffic. How desperate is the situation in that regard?
Yeah, so I know some people personally that are fleeing to Georgia at the moment. And in terms of the length of the queue, it's around 12 kilometres long or directly on the border. But even the towns in Russia leading to that border have now prevented people entering their towns without going through police checkpoints. In addition to that, holding cars back, with that queue becoming unsustainable. It's also on the border with Kazakhstan, and there are increased reports from the Finnish border service that there are an unusual amount of people trying to cross the Finnish border. So all of the land borders with Russia seem to be trying to accommodate this new flood of people trying to leave Russia. The Kremlin says the reports are exaggerated, but frankly, at this point, we don't know how many people are trying to leave. But consider the potential pool of people is about 25 million Russian citizens. So even a small percentage of that is still a lot of people.
And bring us up to date on flights, Stuart, because it appears the situation is either, flights are sold out or too expensive.
Yeah, both of those. So originally when mobilization was called on Wednesday, flights sold out by the afternoon here in Russia for the rest of Wednesday, for Thursday, and were incredibly expensive for Friday. They now seem to have all been sold out for Friday and then incredibly expensive on the weekend. That's, I should add, to clarify, to visa-free countries where Russians can just hop on a plane and then leave. Some examples like Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, countries that are friends with Russia and have easy ways to get into, but don't have a land border like those other countries I mentioned. So it is hard. It is expensive, as you say, 9 to 10 times more expensive to get a ticket out. But I should add, at the moment, there are no official reports of anyone being prevented from leaving because of their potential for military service.
When we talk about prices, Stuart, have you seen any? I assume we're talking, in our currency, thousands of dollars potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. So a flight from Russia to Turkey would be, in terms of US dollars, about 100 to 150 US dollars. Now we're talking about thousands, if getting close to tens of thousands. So it's ultimately the first class. It's the best available ticket to get out because they simply are all booked up. The airlines do not need to have, before this week, the capacity to take so many people.
And then there are also these reports, aren't there, of medics fleeing because they don't want to join the front line.
Yeah, well, part of the difficulty this week for people who may be conscripted is there's been mixed messaging about who exactly would be selected. The first hints from the Ministry of Defence officials were that these would be, first of all, people with military experience, and then those that have particular skills which could be lent to the special military operation. Now, clarifications have later come that they're talking about artillerymen, people trained to drive tanks, and mechanics that have experience in the military. But when you look at the people that are being conscripted, that seems to be slightly erroneous. There are people that are, say, in their 50s that say they have never had military experience, apart from the mandatory 1-year obligatory experience that all late teenagers, early 20s must go through. And also people like, I know an architect who says he's not sure what his skills, what he would be able to add. Perhaps there's an engineering reason that an architect may need to be drafted. But what it's not is exactly what the Ministry of Defence said it would be. And so people confused still about who exactly is most likely to be called up.
Meanwhile, while all of this is going on, there's also voting that started in some of the occupied Ukraine regions, right?
Yeah, and it's all connected. The president saying that it would be required, these extra 300,000 military personnel to defend these regions, which are expected by Ukrainian and Russian officials to become part of Russia next week in these referendums, which have been arranged in conjunction with Russia in 4 of the regions where Russian forces have a presence. 2 of those regions are those that are currently already recognized in Russia as independent nation states, the Luhansk and Donetsk region, as they're known. But 2 of them, Kherson and Zaporizhia, before February, even the minds of the Kremlin were 100% Ukrainian territory, but they have been included in these referendums, and their voting has begun now. It's going to be a period of 5 days, and people can vote from abroad, but only if it's Russia. So Russia and those in areas where Russian forces have control are allowed to vote only in person, no electronic voting. Those in other parts of Ukraine, or perhaps have fled to other countries, do not have the ability to cast a ballot.
Thanks, Stuart. Stuart Smith there, our Russia correspondent, joining us live from Moscow. It is coming up to 6:15. You're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Protests in Iran have spread to more than 80 cities and towns in the 6th day of unrest. They were triggered by the death of a young woman after she was arrested by the morality police for breaking hijab, headscarf rules. A human rights group says at least 31 civilians have been killed, while state television puts the death toll at 17. The real figure, though, is likely to be higher. Here's the BBC's Rana Rahimpour.
Women across Iran are setting their hijabs on fire. They are tired of being beaten up by the morality police for not observing strict Islamic dress code. Their anger was sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini. She was just 22. She was arrested by the morality police in Tehran earlier this month. They said she wasn't wearing the mandatory hijab properly. They say she died of a heart condition, but eyewitnesses say she was beaten up in the police van. Her father told me she was a healthy young woman with no medical condition.
I still cannot believe she's dead. I don't want to believe she's not alive. Iranian state media are saying she had health conditions before, but that's a lie. The medical report was full of lies.
The government has cut the internet in much of the country, so it's hard to get accurate information at the moment. But last time they did this 3 years ago, they killed hundreds of people. With thousands of people protesting across the country, there are fears that far more might be killed this time. Protests are quickly spreading across the country, and they are no longer just about clothing. It's about regime change. Now, men next to women are standing together, chanting death to the dictator. But for Iran, change comes slowly. The Iranian president, who's at the UN, insists that hijab is a personal choice. But even in New York, he demanded that the world-renowned broadcaster Christiane Amanpour wears a headscarf for an interview. This was refused. But the same refusal in Iran is costing lives.
The brutal murder of a young woman last week is sparking fury in South Korea. The 28-year-old was working her evening shift at a subway station when she was stabbed to death. The suspect, a man who had been stalking her for years and a former colleague. It was the day before he was due to be sentenced for stalking her. The BBC's Jean McKenzie reports.
What should be a safe space, now a shrine, to a young subway worker stabbed to death here by a suspect who'd been stalking her for years. Horrified, people have come to express their anger, sorrow and fear. Where have we gone wrong, writes this mother, now questioning whether to let her teenage daughter travel to school alone. Jeonju Hwan was due to be sentenced for stalking the day after her murder. Police had asked the courts to detain him while they investigated, but their request was denied. This murder has exposed weaknesses in South Korea's stalking laws. It's proof, people write, Korea isn't doing enough to protect young women.
I feel angry. Women are continually being stalked and attacked, and our politicians are ignoring it. People say South Korea is safe, but as a woman in my 20s, I think it's very dangerous.
Flowers from remorseful politicians decorate the funeral home. Her family tells us they never used to worry about their daughter. She was so smart and independent. She never told them what was happening. Only her lawyer knew. She reveals how the victim had written to the judge, begging for John to be put in prison so he couldn't hurt her. Anger is rife. We will fight to the end, they shout. People here feel that this murder is symptomatic of a much bigger problem in Korea, that women here are just not safe, and that violence against women is not being taken seriously enough.
We all feel connected through this one death. We fear it could have been any of us. This isn't about the law. What we need is to change the authorities' patriarchal attitude toward the victims.
They're not hoping for a watershed moment. Change has failed to materialise too many times before. Instead, these ribbons symbolise a safety net, a promise to try and protect each other.
We saw massive crowds pour into London for the Queen's final farewell this week, with an estimated 2 million people on the streets to watch the event unfold. The royal family has a massive effect on the British economy by way of attracting tourism for big events. Our reporter Katie Todd spoke to Brand Finance's Michael Josem in London about the significance of the royals.
Our estimates put the annual benefit to the UK, the British economy, at about £2 billion a year. So that's just over 3 billion New Zealand dollars a year. And so that comes primarily from benefits to tourism, but also through a whole lot of ancillary benefits such as royal warrants, informal endorsements of brands. So, for example, when members of the royal family wear various clothing outfits, they go and they sell super quickly.
How do you sort of do that research? How do you quantify the value of individuals to a nation?
Yeah, so our accountants have sought to ascribe a value based on their best estimates, their expert evaluations, and so that includes something like tourism. So we estimate that about 1% of the value of tourism comes in relation to the British monarchy, and so that's not just 1% of people coming just for to see the palaces or the castles and so on, but we estimate that about 1% of the spending of tourists is connected through to the monarchy.
How long does the impact last from an event like the Queen's death?
Sure. So something like Queen's death, we have the immediate economic impact of the public holiday, which is a negative impact, but also over the longer term, those issues of stability, those issues of reliability are what really comes to the fore.
And how much of an impact has the Queen herself had on the British economy?
So we're really reluctant to get into identifying individual impacts there, and so it's much more reasonable to talk about the impact of various events. So, for example, the Queen's Jubilee earlier this year, there was a significant outpouring of emotions and celebrations across the United Kingdom, especially after the pandemic was a real catalyst for people to get together again and to reconnect with friends, family and so on. As we look ahead to the coronation of King Charles III, there was likely to be a greater degree of tourism and memorabilia, because obviously people will have a greater ability to prepare and to be organised for this event, rather than obviously the funeral, which comes on a pretty quick timeline and does not attract international tourism the way an event like a coronation might do.
Donald Trump's claim the FBI planted evidence at Mar-a-Lago is being rubbished. A judge wants the former president's team to back up those claims in a sworn declaration by the end of the month. Hundreds of classified documents were seized from Mr. Trump's home in August. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice notched a big win in the ongoing fight over classified documents. CNN's Jessica Schneider has more.
The Justice Department is once again digging into 100 classified documents that FBI agents seized from Mar-a-Lago.
I think they're going to move forward
very, very quickly.
A 3-judge panel, including 2 Trump appointees, unanimously ruling that DOJ can resume reviewing the classified material as part of its criminal probe into alleged obstruction and unlawful retention of documents, saying the hold that lower court Judge Eileen Cannon put in place caused a real and significant harm on the United States and the public. DOJ says its investigators and FBI agents need to work hand in hand with officials assessing the national security risks of those documents remaining unsecured at Mar-a-Lago.
It's boxes and boxes of pictures, newspaper articles.
In an interview last night, the former president said he didn't know exactly what was in the boxes and that he had blanket authority to declassify anything.
If you're the president of the United States, you can declassify just by saying it's declassified, even by thinking about it.
But even Trump's allies on Capitol Hill questioning that logic.
Up here, we take it very seriously. People can get hurt, people can get killed if it's not stored correctly.
There's a process for declassifying documents.
There is a process that one must go through.
The judges on the 11th Circuit also blasting Trump's unsubstantiated claims of declassification, writing, "The record contains no evidence that any of these records were declassified." And before the special master, plaintiff resisted providing any evidence that he had declassified any of these documents. The judges went on to say that even if Trump had declassified, he still wouldn't have had claim on the documents as personal records.
The U.S. government has every right to look at its own classified documents. Trump derived no right to do that just because he took them to Mar-a-Lago.
The ruling also prohibits Trump's legal team and the special master from reviewing any of the classified documents. It was an about-face from what Judge Eileen Cannon had allowed, and she was forced to amend her order. The special master will now move forward, reviewing only the 11,000 documents that aren't classified.
Here's a good one. Scientists have captured the facial expressions of unborn babies as they taste food for the first time, finding that they smile when they encounter carrots and grimace when it's kale. They'll grow to like it. It's not that bad. Chuck it in a spag bowl. Anyway, researchers from Durham University in England asked 100 pregnant women to swallow capsules and then used ultrasound scans to show the reactions of their unborn children. Professor Naja Riesland is one of those involved in the research.
We do know from prior research, of course, that nutrition, which the fetus receives through the mother's diet, is really important for later healthy development. But what we don't know is when does it actually start? When does the fetus start to taste new foods? And what we have done is at 32 weeks and 36 weeks, we gave the mothers capsules of either kale or carrot. We wanted just the pure reactions of the fetus. And what we found is that when you give a mother 20 minutes before an ultrasound scan, and we did 4D ultrasound scans, that the fetus reacts to kale or to carrot with a different facial expression. Kale, they would grimace, and with carrot, they would kind of make a more smiley face. And we look at whether they react to kale and carrot in the same way as they did in the womb. Because our hope is basically that they get used to the vegetable taste, which is like green vegetables. And therefore, after birth, they will be more amenable to actually eat green vegetables, which would be helping with a healthy diet.
What's wrong with kale? Kale gets such a bad rap. Carrots are good, though. Chinese weddings are lavish and costly occasions most of the time. But now the government in Beijing has launched a massive nationwide campaign to encourage cheaper ones. It's all part of an effort to reverse the trend of fewer couples having fewer babies. Here's the BBC's Celia Hatton, on how much Chinese weddings cost.
Well, they've been getting more and more expensive over the years. So around 20 years ago, the average Chinese wedding would cost maybe 2 or 2.5 times the couple's annual salary. But because so many people would bring money as gifts, they would sort of make up for the cost of the actual wedding. Well, that's all changed. It's now the average wedding is thought to be up to 7 times the couple's annual salary. And they're really community affairs designed to show off the couple's wealth. So we'll often see the bride changing outfits a few times during the wedding. It's often quite important for many, many people to be invited to huge banquets that are traditionally serve 8 courses, because 8 is a lucky number in China. And you can simply add on more and more things. Really, when we get down to China's poorest people, it's still very difficult because it's still traditionally expected that the groom will be able to supply the bride with a brand new apartment or all the comforts of life. So many poor families think they simply can't afford to do this. They want to bring down the cost of weddings in hopes that more people will be able to afford to tie the knot, to formalize their relationship. This is important in China because the Communist Party has instilled a structure where in order to have a baby, you have to get permission from your local work unit, your local neighborhood. In order to get permission to have a baby, you need to show your marriage certificate. So by encouraging couples to get married, they're then hoping that more couples will go on to have a baby, thereby boosting the population, which has been declining for years. A lot of people are sort of laughing on Chinese social media today to say, look, the prospect of buying 3 wedding dresses isn't what's stopping me from getting married. Women, for example, are really rejecting marriage in high numbers. Women are becoming much more educated in China, frankly, more educated than men, and they're rejecting the traditional gender roles that go along with marriage. They don't necessarily want to have a baby and be forced to resign from their jobs, which often happens in China.
And that's it from us tonight. The Late News team will keep you updated throughout the night. Of course, daylight saving starts on Sunday. Don't forget to put your clocks forward. One more piece of feedback. What does this say? A whitewash for the New Zealand teams on the weekend. That is from... it's from me. Have a great one. Look after each other.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. 4 Russian-occupied Ukrainian provinces have begun referendums on whether to join the Russian Federation. Air New Zealand is flying a replacement crew to Fiji to take passengers on flight NZ1 from New York to Auckland. That crew is currently en route to Nandi after NZ1 diverted there to refuel. A lack of interest in the function of councils is being suggested as a reason for low voting numbers. And a school strike for climate in Christchurch called on the council to increase housing density in the city. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather at 7.
When asked what colour they'd like on a Bluetooth speaker, a group chose a rainbow of options. But when they could actually take one home, each of them took a black one.
This is a clear example of people saying what they think they want you to hear, but when it comes down to the chase, their real desire can be quite different.
Dr. Angus Campbell explores the problem with data-driven design. You can hear him in Smart Talk at 7 p.m. Sunday on RNZ National.
Kia ora, Paul Bushnell, and I'm Brian Crump, getting ready for another night on RNZ National, where because today is the spring equinox. It happened just after 1 this afternoon, our time. At that moment, the sun was exactly the axis, the line that connects the sun and goes through the earth was at exactly 90 degrees to the axis of our north and south poles. And it means that the day is as long as the night everywhere on earth